Thank you for joining us. And we are delighted to welcome back our dear friend, Dr. Vincent DeLuise, for this very special presentation on Beethoven. This is Vincent's second career. He's a retired, successful ophthalmologist, and he's now a very frequent speaker and lecturer, and a musician himself, plays the clarinet. And we've been lucky enough to have him here for a number of musical presentations that he puts together, coordinates, and plays in, and for some wonderful lectures as well. He is also the cultural ambassador for the Waterbury Symphony Orchestra, and he is the president of the Connecticut Summer Opera Foundation. And we're delighted to have him here again tonight for this very special presentation. Everyone, please welcome Vincent DeLuise.
Thanks so much, Margaret. Thank you very much, Margaret. And thank you all for coming. Beethoven. You all know his music. You all know something about his life. And I thought what I would do for the next hour is demythologize him. And therefore, the title of my talk is Beethoven Unvarnished. On your way out this evening, you'll have a book list, and of the many books written about this greatest of composers in Western civilization, and this is coming from me, a Mozart fanatic, the wondrously lyrical book by Edmund Morris, who lives up here in this area, called Beethoven, the Eternal Composer, is probably the best initial book that you should read. And of the great biographies, Jan Swafford's is probably the best, Beethoven, Conflict and Struggle. It'll be on the book lists. Beethoven, Ludwig van Beethoven. Close your eyes and listen. Of course, many of you recognize where that comes from. It's the last movement of the Great Fifth Symphony. But who was Beethoven? So if I say to you Beethoven, what kind of adjectives come to your mind? Indomitable, monumental, creative, revolutionary, passionate, heroic, defiant, courageous. Some of those adjectives are part of Beethoven the Myth. If I asked you a little bit more about Beethoven in an unvarnished sense, Beethoven also was arrogant, stubborn, money-hungry, penny-pinching, suspicious, devious, messy yet strict in himself. That's Beethoven the Man. Can we correlate, combine, come to some kind of acceptance of this dialectic, of the difference between Beethoven, the man, from the myth? Can we separate the man from the myth? All great geniuses have a mythology about them. Or, in the case of Beethoven tonight, are the man and the myth entwined? So there's going to be this notion of conflict and struggle, this dialectic. And Beethoven, like so many geniuses, is a study in contrasts. He was a monumental genius. He brought Viennese classical style to Romanticism, even though others had knocked on that door. There's no question that Mozart knocked on the door of Romanticism with his fantasias and the C minor and D minor piano concerti and Don Giovanni and the Requiem. But even though we say that Mozart was the first freelance artist, actually Beethoven was the first freelance artist in that he never worked for anybody. He never worked for anybody. He worked for himself. He wasn't under the thumb of a Kapellmeister and given a salary anywhere. 342 compositions, of which, as many of you know, if you know your numbers, 138 of which are numbered as opus, opera, of which we have 9 symphonies, as you well know, 32 piano sonatas, 7 concerti for various instruments, 5 for piano. Of course, there's the violin concerto. And 204 works without opus numbers. In German, that's Werke ohne Opus, W-O-O, the Woo numbers. And the Woos, some of the Woos are very famous pieces, but they just don't have a number. Beethoven didn't want to put numbers on some of them, so he pushed them back, even though he wrote them early in his life. He pushed them back, and they never got cataloged as such. Interestingly, for a man who came from a vocal background, as we'll see in a second, one opera, which he worked on 4 times. As you know, there's 4 versions of the Leonore Overture. We have the Fidelio Overture, which is the one that's in the opera, and then there's 3 other also rans. One opera, Mozart wrote 22. Ludwig van Beethoven, we don't really know the date of his birth. We know that he was baptized on 17 December of 1770, and probably that's 24 hours after birth in North Germany in a Catholic town. So we back into the 16th of December. That's what we usually celebrate as Beethoven's birthday, although there is no birth certificate to prove that. He lived in Bonn until 1792, took a trip to Vienna in 1787 that I'll tell you about in a moment. And he lived in Vienna for the rest of his life, just with a couple of trips to Pressburg and a couple of other towns, but he lived basically the rest of his life in Vienna, dying there at the age of 57 years old, which is amazing that he could have done so much at 57. Then again, look at Mozart at 35 years and 9 months. The notion of nature and nurture, genetics, environment, has to be looked at. Beethoven's grandfather, Ludwig van Beethoven, the same name, a man whom we worshipped, even though Ludwig van Beethoven Sr. died when Beethoven was 3. So despite what Beethoven said during his life about how much he knew and loved his grandfather, how much do you remember before your 3rd birthday? Ludwig van Beethoven was a very prosperous man, a successful organist and chorister, made quite a bit of money, so that's good. But it was squandered largely by Beethoven's father, Johann van Beethoven, who was a relatively mediocre tenor, a hornist, a French hornist, a violist, a tavern keeper, and an alcoholic, and an abusive father in Beethoven's life. That's one of the several things in that wondrous movie, Immortal Beloved, that was true about Beethoven's life, that his father was abusive. His mother, Maria Magdalena, was of German heritage, and Beethoven really loved his mom. Beethoven loved his mother. And that plays into Beethoven's psychodynamics as he got older. Bonn in 1790 wasn't the capital of Germany because Germany wasn't yet a country in 1790. It was part of the Holy Roman Empire. The German country, like Austria and other countries, came into being in the mid-19th century, as you know. Italy didn't become a country until 1860. As I said, his grandfather was Ludwig van Beethoven, so let me disabuse you of this von thing right now. It's Ludwig van Beethoven, but it's not Ludwig von Beethoven. Von is the German appellative. Ludwig van Beethoven came from the town of Betuwe in Flanders, which is Belgium. So therefore, going forward, if I wake up at 2 in the morning, it's V-A-N. Most musicologists divide things in 3s. It's interesting, and I believe in synthesizing more than dissecting, so I'm going to lump 2 periods into one. Beethoven's first period was the pre-Vienna period, the Bonn works, the Bonn compositions, and there were some. And then the Viennese classical style that began when he went to Vienna for good in 1792, up to about 1803. The second period of Beethoven's compositional life was the heroic style period, from 1803 to about 1819. And then there is that mature, sublime style of Beethoven that began in 1819 when his deafness was so profound that it was inconceivable that a man of this talent who needed to hear was bereft of that great sense. He's one of the only people that I can think of who would have given up his sight for his hearing. And indeed, it's that third period, that sublime period, that mature period that gives some of his, arguably most of his greatest works, the Missa Solemnis, the last piano sonatas, the last string quartets, the Diabelli variations, and of course the Ninth Symphony. That was a personal journey through music, given the roar on the other side of silence, as George Eliot called it, the roar on the other side of silence. In terms of his physiognomy, he was 5'5" tall, muscular and stocky, pockmarked with acne and smallpox scars, which wasn't that uncommon back then. And as already you know, he has a very prominent forehead. Unlike Mozart, many of whose portraits are unattested, and I've written a lot about that in the published literature, Beethoven was painted by the best painters of his area in Central Europe. We have numerous paintings of Beethoven that are truly him, and you'll see most of them this evening. And you can see how prominent the forehead is. A strong chin, and he was dark complexioned, interestingly enough, to the point that in Bonn he was nicknamed Il Spagnolo, that would be Italian, for the Spaniard, because he looked swarthy and he looked Latin. That muscular, stocky body and that prominent forehead made him sort of lean forward when he was walking. And this very famous caricature by Teček of 1823 shows you our hero, the object of our affection this evening, sort of leaning forward as he is walking. And he walked a lot, as we will see. Haydn, Mozart, Beethoven. And when we talk about Haydn, Mozart, and early Beethoven, we are talking about the core, the heart of Viennese classical style. What was the relationship between these three great geniuses? Well, as you can see from the dates, Haydn was the grandpa. Mozart was 14 years older than Beethoven and well established in Vienna when Beethoven arrived for the first time in April of 1787 for 2 weeks, specifically under the aegis of and promotion of the Bonn aristocrats, Count Wallstein and others, who wanted him to meet Mozart so badly. And as Beethoven left Bonn for the 600-mile journey to Vienna, Beethoven's first patron, Ferdinand Count Wallstein, said, and I quote, "My dear Beethoven, you are now leaving for Vienna to consummate a long desire. With the help of assiduous work, may you receive the spirit of Mozart from the hands of Haydn. You will read that Beethoven played for Mozart and that Mozart said to his friends, 'Watch that man. Someday he's going to make a great name for himself and there'll be something to talk about.' My research, which is part of the references that you will receive, is that they never met. Beethoven's arrogance was such that would he not have mentioned in his letters or to friends that he had met the great Mozart? Mozart was the god of Vienna when Beethoven got there in April of 1787 after this 5-week journey from Bonn. But Beethoven was only there for 2 weeks because Mom, Maria Maddalena Beethoven, was sick of tuberculosis and was dying. And a letter got to him from his brothers, and he had to run back to Bonn, and so he left. There's no mention in any of Mozart's letters that they met. There's no mention in any of Beethoven's letters that they met. Karl Czerny and Ferdinand Ries, Beethoven's two best friends, don't think that he ever played for Beethoven. And the only reference we have of this meeting, this great meeting, is Otto Jahn in 1856, the great Mozart biographer, who said that, quote, "I have it on great authority that Mozart may have heard Beethoven playing." And he goes on to describe the event and the quote that I gave you. So there's some mythology for you. But even though Mozart and Beethoven never met, in my opinion, and there's no data to prove me wrong, there's no question that Mozart was integral to Beethoven's life and musical style. In fact, the Jupiter Symphony, C major, so glorious and brilliant, and the first symphony of Beethoven almost meld together. So here's Symphony No. 1 by Ludwig van Beethoven. I'm sorry about the 30-second preamble, but it's Leonard Bernstein and the Vienna Philharmonic, so you'll enjoy that too. So here we are in the Musikverein in Vienna. Lenny loved the Vienna Philharmonic almost as much as he loved the BSO and the New York Philharmonic, and they loved him. Some of his greatest recordings are with the Wiener Philharmoniker. You gotta love Lenny. He's so cool. He's just so cool. He knows everything. Notice no score, like Metropolis before him and Lauren Mazel. That's very different from that last movement of the fifth, isn't it? It's very controlled. It's Mozartian, but there's something also about it that's not Mozartian. There's a propulsive quality to Beethoven, even in the slow adagio sections. So there's a Mozartian Haydnesque quality to early Beethoven. They do meld together in, this is classic Viennese classical style, tonic dominant. Any modulation comes back to home keys very quickly. Nothing scary, nothing passionate even, but there's that propulsive, momentous quality about it. Even as he was composing and even as he was making his way in Vienna, 6 years before this date, he wrote to his brothers that he was having trouble hearing. And so in 1802, in the summer of 1802, he moved to Heiligenstadt, which is outside of Vienna, but it was quieter and more pastoral. It was a place that he could think and not be annoyed by the horse carriages and the yelling of the street people. But he recognized by by October of that year, that the deafness was real. And let me read you the Heiligenstadt Testament. This is important, so you have to hear all of it. To my brothers Karl and Johann, you who think I am stubborn, how greatly do you wrong me? You do not know the secret causes of my seeming to be so. For 6 years, I have been a hopeless case, aggravated by senseless physicians, cheated in the hope of improvement, finally compelled to face the prospect of a lasting malady whose cure will take years or perhaps be impossible. I was compelled to isolate myself, to live in loneliness. When I tried to forget all of this, how harshly was I repulsed by the sad experience of my bad hearing. It was impossible to say to people, "Speak louder, shout, for I am deaf." How could I possibly admit to such an infirmity in the one sense which should have been more perfect in me than others? A sense which I once possessed in the highest, a perfection such as few surely in my profession have enjoyed. I must live like an exile. If I approach people, a hot terror seizes upon me, a fear that I may be subjected to the danger of letting my condition be observed. Thus it has been during the past year, which I spent in the country, commanded by my intelligent physician to spare my hearing as much as possible. What a humiliation when one stood beside me and heard a flute in the distance and I heard nothing. Or someone heard the shepherd singing, and again, I heard nothing. Such incidents brought me to the verge of despair, but little more and I would have put an end to my life. Only art has withheld me, as it seemed impossible to leave the world until I had produced all that I felt called upon me to produce, and so I have endured this wretched existence. The notion of creativity and genius is fascinating to me. I would have killed myself or might have hurt myself, and so would have you. You would have been so disconsolate and so depressed. You would have done something, or you would have stopped composing. You would have done something else. You would have just been bummed out, and you would have spent the rest of your days not being as creative as you were yesterday. A genius, Mozart, Monet with his cataracts, Degas with his optic neuropathy. A genius, Mozart with all of his many diseases. A genius sees disease not as an obstacle, but as an opportunity. And we would not have Beethoven's music had he not gone deaf. We would not have Monet's last great works had he not gone blind. Degas changing from oils to pastels to sculpture to photography, changing the media in which he worked, not giving up his art. Think about that. Think about genius and creativity and the indefatigable courage and power of someone like Beethoven. So the chronology is the chronology. Diminished hearing in 1796. So he was born in 1770. So at 26, he starts not noticing he can hear. That's early. I mean, you and I have bad hearing, but I'm in my 60s. This was at 26 years of age. Tinnitus, which is ringing in the ear, which often occurs with neurosensory hearing loss. We read the Heiligenstadt Testament. He started using ear trumpets. He was having difficulty with higher pitches. He started having conversation books, meaning he would write questions and people would write the answers, or he would say the question, they would write the answer in the conversation book. And in 1819, that's when we talk about the mature sublime style, the progression to total sensory neural deafness. Now there's argument about that. Some authors say that Beethoven had some hearing well into the 1820s, well into 1823, which is the date of the Ninth Symphony. But whatever he had was minimal. And we'll see a beautiful excerpt of Immortal Beloved to give you an example of what might have occurred in his life. So there's some of his ear trumpets, his lunettes and cornets, and his conversation book. There's a page from his conversation book. He would ask a question and the recipient would write the answer. I talked about Beethoven walking. Mozart loved to walk in the forests outside of Vienna. Beethoven too walked, as did Brahms, with pieces of paper, Zettelchen, scraps of paper, on which he would write down motifs and melodic fragments. Against a tree, while he was walking, he would write down 6 or 7 note figurations, and then when he got back to Vienna, he would figure that all out. Fascinating that walking, that creative walking, is such a catalyst for the creative spark, for the creative process, not only in Beethoven, but in Mozart and in Brahms, who adored both Mozart and Beethoven, and in whose music we hear Mozart and Beethoven. And Brahms probably was the last of the great romantics who incorporated classical style in his music, even as he was prefiguring Schoenberg and modernism. As I mentioned earlier, Beethoven had patrons. He didn't work for anybody, but he had people that supported him, that loved his work, and that supported him. Prince Karl Lichnowsky, Count Andrei Razumovsky, and Prince Joseph Lobkowitz were 3 of his Viennese patrons. Look at what he wrote for them. The Piano Trio Opus 1 and the Second Symphony and the Pathétique Sonata for Lichnowsky. 3 great string quartets, the Opus 59 group for Razumovsky, the Razumovsky quartets. And for Lobkowitz, the 3rd, 5th, and 6th symphonies, 3 string quartets, and the triple concerto. But for the Archduke, Rudolph, who was, by the way, his only composition student. Beethoven had about 7 or 8, well, more than that. He had many piano students, mostly young, pretty, aristocratic women that we will talk about momentarily. Mozart did too, by the way. Hummel being Mozart's greatest piano student, that was a guy, but most of Mozart's great piano students were phenomenally gifted women. Beethoven as well had many piano students. 1 composition student, the Archduke Rudolph, who was the younger brother of Leopold II. And Beethoven dedicated the Archduke Piano Trio, the 4th and 5th Piano Concerto, the Les Adieux Piano Sonata, the Hammerklavier Piano Sonata, the Violin Sonata Opus 96, the Missa Solemnis was dedicated to the Archduke, and the Grosse Fuge of the Opus 130, which is today, even today, this modern dissonantal piece that's hard for us to really understand and listen to 200 years later. Let's listen to a bit of the beautiful Archduke, which is one of the masterpieces of the piano trio literature, with the trio solisti. This and the Tchaikovsky, to me, are the two greatest piano trios, the A minor Tchaikovsky. There's a sense of nobility here. Must move on, sadly. Even as he's composing, even as he's losing his hearing, his defiant, courageous, indefatigable self says, "I am not content with my work so far. Henceforth, I shall take a new path." And I sort of did a little bit of chronology difference there. The Opus 97 was obviously after 1802. We talk about people's handwritings or people's calligraphy as a barometer, a benchmark, a metric of who they are. So there you see Beethoven in the Ninth Symphony, and it's rushed, but good. But we have this thought that Beethoven would just scratch things out and rub things out and restart them. And this is a Beethoven composition that is classic Beethoven. He didn't like that idea, so he struck it out and started again. Not that Mozart is perfect. This is a Mozart composition. This is the beginning of one of the fantasies. And you can see that it's clean, much cleaner than Beethoven. Also, notice how the staves are more vertical and Beethoven's were much more angular, moving forward. That propulsive quality is even seen in the calligraphy. But Mozart made mistakes too. This mythology that Mozart was the amanuensis of the deity, just taking the deity's notes and just writing everything down as fast as he could, is another lie. The lie, that's just, the truth is the lie that all of us currently believe. That's a lie that you shouldn't believe anymore. The truth about Mozart is that he was a human being and he made mistakes. But it is true that his compositions tended to be more cleaner. But then again, Mozart wrote largely in Viennese classical style with a lot of rules and a lot of constraints. When you're dealing with Romanticism, you're dealing with anything goes. You're dealing with breaking rules. And when you break rules, and there are no rules, because you're inventing the rules as you're going along, then you can see that Beethoven had to figure things out. And that passion in Beethoven is evident everywhere. Maurizio Pollini, the last movement of the Appassionata Sonata. Again, that propulsive momentum, always pushing forward, driving. diminished seventh, that ambiguous chord. And he goes on. We talk about when does Romanticism begin? Well, I told you that Romanticism really begins in the 1780s with Mozart. Let's not forget that. And the young Hummel and the young Spohr. But really, Romanticism began on April 7th, 1805, when the audience at the Theater an der Wien, which had just been built in 1801, heard the Eroica Symphony. And this is a fascinating story. This is part of that new path in music that Beethoven was talking about. The original dedicatee of the Eroica Symphony was Napoleon himself. Beethoven liked the early Napoleon, and that Napoleon was breaking rules and seeming to be someone who was going to destroy the aristocracy and destroy the status quo and destroy all that was sort of accreted and caked and old and hierarchical and break all of that. But even as Beethoven was writing the Third Symphony, which he originally called Bonaparte's Symphony, he changed it because he saw what Napoleon was doing. He was about to invade Vienna at this point. And so he changes the dedication from Bonaparte's Symphony to Per festeggiare il sovvenire di un gran uomo, in Italian, on the cover, on the frontispiece, to celebrate the memory of a great man, meaning Napoleon, and he dedicates it to one of his patrons, Count Lobkowitz. Heroic style, we talked about this is the second part of Beethoven's style. We had the early Vienna, the early classical style. This is the heroic style. Drama, birth, resistance, strife, rebirth, driving rhythms, the monumentality and the propulsion, the transcendence. So here is a bit of the Eroica so that we hear what in 1805, excuse me, was the beginning of Romanticism. Even though they have Jacques-Louis David's Napoleon on the horse in the back, we know that it's not for Napoleon. It was scratched out. Now, to our 20th century ears, it sounds pretty normal, pretty classical almost. But turn the dial back 200 years, and this was new. This was new music. This was different. It was vital. So Beethoven says, the true artist is not proud. He sees that art has no limits. He feels how far he is from the goal. Though he may be admired by others, he is sad not to have reached that point at which his genius appears as a distant guiding sun. On December 22nd, 1808, in the bitter cold of Vienna, in an unheated auditorium at the Theater an der Wien, Beethoven put on what is still considered the greatest show on earth in classical music. One man, one orchestra, 8 pieces of music with an intermission. That's what the little hyphen reminds me of, to tell you. So there was an intermission. It was about 3.5 hours long. It began with the beautiful aria A Perfido, one of Beethoven's gorgeous vocal pieces, Adelaide being another one, Ungefährliche Geliebte being another one. This is a man who nobody thinks can write for the voice, wrote gorgeous things for the voice. Then the Pastoral Symphony. Notice that it came before the 5th, but that's another story about which was written first. It doesn't really matter. He programmed the Pastoral. And by the way, he called it the Pastoral. The 2 of the 9 symphonies that were named by Beethoven were the Eroica, he named it, and the Pastoral, the 3rd and the 6th. The others, if they have nicknames, were not by him. The Gloria and from the Mass in C major, which you don't hear very much, the Mass in C major. You hear the Missa Solemnis, which is much more difficult to perform, but the Mass in C is glorious as well. The 4th Piano Concerto with our hero Ludwig as soloist, of course, then intermission, then the 5th Symphony, the Sanctus and Benedictus from the Mass, some improvisations, and then he ends with the choral fantasy, which, if any of you know, is this glorious piece of music for piano, orchestra, and full chorus, and has sort of ode to joy inklings in the last part of it. Go home and listen to the choral fantasy. It's absolutely spectacular. It's a spectacular showpiece for the piano. And then, of course, we have this great piece of music. And again, we have Lenny, and we have the Vienna Philharmonic. And I guess if anybody asks you Beethoven, this is what you're going to respond. The fifth. I will take fate by the throat. It will never bend me completely to its will. So that defiance is not mythology, is it? I love that Lenny tries to eke out every drop of passion and romanticism when he conducts Beethoven, Brahms, or Mahler. He draws it out of the orchestra. I will take fate by the throat. It will never bend me completely to its will. But there's an intimate side to Beethoven. And when I was in medical school, I found this record. Robert White was still alive. Sam Sanders was still alive as a very young Yo-Yo Ma. And Ani Kavafian, who's been principal violinist of the New Haven Symphony until very recently. I think she may still be in the top right. This is one of my favorite records. This is Beethoven writing Welsh, Irish, and Scottish songs. O Mary, at thy window be. I love this. Beethoven. With an exquisite Yo-Yo Ma. Robert White is still alive. I apologize. He's teaching at Juilliard. My mistake. Thank goodness. Just listen to how sweet this is. Beethoven. Isn't that nice? Isn't that sweet? And these were relatively late. Opus 108 is up there in the 18 teens. 1817, there you go. And Robert White's sweet Irish tenor is just phenomenal. Music is like a dream, one that I cannot hear. So with all of the works that you're hearing, he's losing his hearing. So as a physician, I have spent decades looking at the medical histories of my heroes, Mozart and Beethoven, Schumann and Schubert, Brahms. So of course, there's lots of diagnoses here, partly because during his life, we don't have lab data, we just have clinical information that we try to understand. So he had smallpox, his mother died of tuberculosis, he was going deaf, he had headaches and depression, he probably was cyclothymic. He had terrible GI problems, terrible throughout his life. Colic in Deutsche, diarrhea and abdominal pain, he had rheumatic fever and gout. As an ophthalmologist, I've explored his eye problems. He had recurrent uveitis, iritis, jaundice, which is liver disease, and at the end of his life, dropsy, which is tremendous lymphedema to the point that he had to be paracentised many times in his abdomen to remove liters of fluid, of ascites fluid. This multi-system immunologic disease might have been Crohn's. We're not really sure. Sarcoid has been posited, systemic lupus. Whenever you have a lot of pieces, a lot of diagnoses on a piece of paper, nobody knows what's going on. The diagnosis of his deafness has been debated. The cochlear otosclerosis, the sensory neural hearing loss. People think that it was something to do with lead in the wine that he was drinking. And it is true that they would fortify wines in Europe in that time with lead. They didn't know that lead was toxic in the early 1800s. So it's been thought that Beethoven's problems were lead-related. Beethoven's death was inferentially lead-related, but I'm going to show you some data against that. Paget's disease of bone, not of the cervix, Paget's disease of bone, there are several Paget's diseases, would explain the high frontal bossing that he had, this enormous forehead. But that's another guess at a diagnosis. Again, the ophthalmology piece, because I'm an ophthalmologist, is that he dedicated the transcription of his Opus 20 septet, the great Opus 38 trio, which I played once in my life for clarinet, cello, and piano, to a physician who was his eye doctor. And Beethoven was nearsighted, he was myopic, and he developed eye pain, and he had several episodes of iritis, which could have been related to his bowel disease. We now know that iritis, eye inflammations, have a relationship, among other things, to rheumatoid arthritis, of course, but also to inflammatory bowel disease. There is a relationship there that's only been known for the last maybe 15 years. He had liver failure, and we know that, as you'll see in a moment from the autopsy. Hepatic coma was the end, and according to Anselm Huttenbrenner, who was in the room the day that Beethoven died, March 26, 1827, in the Schwarzbanier house, he says, "There was a sudden flash of lightning which illuminated the death chamber while snow lay outside, and a violent thunderclap. At this startling, awful peal of thunder, the dying man suddenly raised his head and stretched out his right arm majestically, like a general giving orders to an army. This was but for an instant. The arm sank down. He fell back. Beethoven was dead." What were Beethoven's last words? Another mythology. Some say it was "Plaudite, amici, commedia finita est." Applaud, clap, friends, the comedy is ended. Another source says that it was pity, pity, too late, because his dear friend Hummel, the same Hummel that Mozart trained, had brought several wonderful bottles of wine, and Beethoven understood what Hummel was giving him and said, "Pity, pity, too late, that I can't drink it because I'm sick, I'm very sick." And says to Hummel, "Is it not true, Hummel, that I have some talent after all?" Interesting. So one of those three things, or perhaps none of those three things, were his last words. Again, there's mythology that we sometimes can't figure out. His funeral cortege was one of the most important things ever to happen to Vienna before the 1850s, which was over 30,000 people in the central square witnessing the cortege. There's the death mask. And you can see the swelling of his face. It's tremendous swelling that you can see there. So the official death certificate says Wassersucht. Wassersucht was also on Mozart's death certificate, among other things, but we're not talking about Mozart tonight. Wassersucht basically means water in the body, so dropsy or water or edema. Interestingly, the autopsy was done by Professor Karl Wagner, whose assistant was Karl Rokitansky. Karl Rokitansky was on the page 1 of our pathology book in medical school at Cornell in 1973. Rokitansky was the father, the grandfather of anatomic pathology, and his first autopsy of the 60,000 that he did in his brilliant career was assisting Wagner, not Richard Wagner, Karl Wagner, on the autopsy of Beethoven. Emaciated, skull with great thickness, brain of deep and wide convolution, auditory nerves that were shriveled, arteries dilated to more than a crow's quill and like cartilage. Massive amounts of abdominal fluid, a liver with cirrhosis, a spleen double the normal size, and renal papillary necrosis, which was actually a diagnosis that they knew about back then in the kidneys. Now, During that funeral cortege, he lays in state, and dozens of people walk by, and a few of them snip hair. It was something that was commonly done back then. And several pieces, or several lockets, if you will, of Beethoven's hair have found their way to the present day. And there's an interesting book by Russell Martin called Beethoven's Hair, which you might want to get. I didn't put it on the reference list because it's been debated about the hair. But the hair exists. In 1994 at Sotheby's, it was purchased by the Ira Brilliant Beethoven Center in California for $7,300. Not that much money for Beethoven's hair. But anyway, there are examples of Beethoven's hair in Hartford, at the Library of Congress, at the British Library in London, and at the Beethoven House in Bonn. And again, of course, at the Ira Brilliant Beethoven Center. They have, the Ira Brilliant Center sent the hair samples to 2 laboratories, the Argonne Lab near Chicago being one of them, and they sent bone samples from the skull. There's a long story about the skull, but we have Beethoven's skull, or at least bone fragments from the skull. Mozart's calvarium, a calvarium is a skull minus the mandible, at the Mozarteum may or may not be Mozart's, probably isn't, and that's a long story that I can tell you about on a different day. But with respect to Beethoven, we do have bone fragments, so they tested the bone fragments, and they found lead levels that were 100 times normal. So this is where the story of lead comes into play. No mercury, by the way, and therefore no syphilis. You know, back then everybody had syphilis. Well, Beethoven didn't have syphilis, and neither did Mozart for that matter. Mercury was the only thing they had back then for syphilis. They didn't have penicillin. That was Fleming in 1940s. So in the 1800s, they had mercury. There was no mercury detected at all. Lead poisoning can cause lots of stuff. Hypertension, headaches, irritability, memory loss, gastroenteritis, hearing loss, muscle pain, gonadal damage, and cataracts, just for starters. But the lead poisoning hypothesis has been contested. Professor Todd at Mount Sinai in New York City got examples of the hair and bone, and he says there are normal bone lead levels, excuse me. So Professor Todd recently at Sinai disputes the lead story in Beethoven, saying that he may have drunk leaded wine, but he didn't have sufficient amounts of lead to cause toxicity. That argument has been rebutted by people that have gone deep into the bone fragments and claim that there's lead there. Because Todd's argument is, if you find lead on a superficial part of bone, that's irrelevant. For lead to cause disease, it has to be well deep into the bone. And you can't tell from the hair, but well deep into the bone. So there's an argument there as well. Beethoven and Eros, Beethoven in love. And so we're getting towards the back of the story now. Beethoven was a serial monogamist, as far as I know, but he always fell in love with unattainable women. They were beautiful, talented either vocally or pianistically, more the latter, and unattainable in that they were all aristocrats. That was his life. Although his first love, which most people don't know about, was his best friend's sister, Eleanor von Breunig, back in Bonn, whom he sweetly used to call Lorchen. Lorchen was his first love. And as Professor Morris beautifully says in his book, Beethoven, the Eternal Composer, the closest that Ludwig got to Lorchen was thigh-to-thigh touching during piano sonatas that they played together. The Heiligenstadt Testament to his brothers Karl and Johann was never sent. The letter to the Immortal Beloved was never sent. And here it is. Good morning, on the 7th of July, 1812. Though still in bed, my thoughts go out to you, my immortal beloved. So there was a woman in his life that he loved more than the others. Joyfully then sadly, waiting to learn whether or not fate will hear us, I can only live fully with you or not at all. Yes, I am resolved to wander away from you until I can fly to your arms and say that I am really at home with you and can send my soul enwrapped in you into the land of spirits. Yes, unhappily it must be so. You will be the more contained since you know my fidelity. No one else can ever possess my heart. Never. Oh God, why must one be parted from one whom one so loves? And yet my life in Vienna is a wretched life. Your love makes me at once the happiest and the unhappiest of men. At mine age, I need a steady, quiet life. Can that be so in our connection? My angel, I have just been told that the mail coach goes every day. Therefore, I must close at once so that you may receive the letter at once. Be calm. Only by calm consideration of our existence can we achieve our purpose to live together. Be calm. Love me today, yesterday. What tearful longings for you. You, my life, my all, farewell. Oh, continue to love me. Never misjudge the most faithful heart of your beloved. And we see his handwriting there on the right. Ever thine, ever mine, ever ours, Ludwig van Beethoven. So there are many candidates, and this has been debated for decades. Countess Giulietta Guicciardi, the philanthropist Anthony Brentano, the Countess Josephine von Brunswick, Countess Teresa von Brunswick, her sister, Baroness Teresa Malfatti, and the Countess Anna Marie Erdődy. So there's at least 6 women that are in the running for the Die Unsterbliche Geliebte, the Immortal Beloved. For Giulietta Guicciardi, he wrote the Moonlight Sonata, and I love this scene from the Immortal Beloved. Gary Oldham playing Beethoven, those of you that have seen the movie, and looking quite a bit like him. There's Giulietta. Sometimes cinema can really show you what might have really happened. I choose to believe that this is sort of something that did happen. But there were others that he loved. The Baroness Teresa Malfatti, he wrote a piece called For Teresa, but it was misprinted by Breitkopf, and it became something that you know even more, For Elisa, which every piano student does at about the 3rd or 4th year. For the Countess Erdődy, he wrote piano works, he wrote vocal works, and he dedicated his 2 Opus 102 cello sonatas. For Countess Josephine von Brunswick, he wrote An die Hoffnung. For Countess Teresa von Brunswick, he also wrote some pieces of music. Maynard Solomon, in his great biography of Beethoven in the 1990s, has come to the conclusion that of these 2 finalists, it was Anthony Brentano that was the Immortal Beloved, and that's been contested as well. But to Brentano, there were the An die Geliebte vocal works. There was the Diabelli Variations in the last couple of years of his life, and she was the presumptive dedicatee of the 2 great piano sonatas, the Opus 110 and the Opus 111. And so it is thought that she was the one that fits the bill as the dedicatee of the love letters from Teplitz that we just read, the Immortal Beloved love letter, which, by the way, was found in Beethoven's desk, along with the Heiligenstadt Testament, by Schindler after Beethoven died. Neither letter was ever sent. The other tragedy in Beethoven's life was the argument about his nephew, Karl. Karl was the son of Beethoven's brother, Karl Kaspar, and Johanna Ries von Beethoven. And in the movie, it's Johanna Ries that is the Immortal Beloved, which is a fascinating psychodynamic that the producers and the directors of the movie made the sister-in-law, of all people, the Immortal Beloved. Clearly, the same way that Salieri wasn't there when Mozart died, that whole thing with Schaeffer and Foreman, but it was a great movie. Amadeus is one of the great movies ever made because of the music, if nothing else. And for Hollywood, this was a great storyline, but she wasn't the Immortal Beloved, but she was the mother of Beethoven's nephew, Karl. There were lawsuits galore for 7 years. So here's a man who can't hear, who's trying to compose, who's in courtrooms trying to take custody of his nephew, and he ends up winning the lawsuit because Joanna was a bit dissolute in her life. Then he loses custody, and then he gains it again. The poor kid attempts suicide along the way. He does end up getting this, and clearly Karl was the son that he never had from the woman that he never was able to marry, or a woman that he was never able to marry. We hear his anguish in the beginning of the string quartet in F major, the Opus 135. You can hear the words, muss es sein, must it be? Es muss sein, it must be. This is part of that mature, sublime Beethoven on the other side of silence. Beethoven's Ninth Symphony was begun in 1817 and completed in 1824. And you recognize it, of course, for that great, glorious last movement. And it was the first symphony, because I can't think of one written by Haydn, Mozart, or Vivaldi, or Hasse, or anybody that included a chorus. The architecture is monumental. There are themes that are in sonata form, which is hearkening back to Viennese classical style. There are modal motifs going back to the 16th century. There's fugue and counterpoint from his days as a student with Haydn. And yet, it is all about Beethoven. His hearing was so bad at that point that he was not allowed to conduct the piece. He was allowed to stand next to the conductor to give the tempi of the four movements. And at the end of the Beethoven Ninth, you know the story, he was so deaf that he didn't know that the symphony was over, and so Carolyn Unger, the alto, had to turn him physically around to face the adoring crowd who was standing and throwing hats in the air and giving him the adoration that he so deserved. This great work, the Symphony No. 9 in D minor, the Ode to Joy. My German is terrible, but listen to the words. Freude schöner Götterfunken, Tochter aus Elysium, wir betreten Feuertrunken, himmlische den Heiligtum. Deine Zauber binden wieder, was dem Mode streng geteilt. Alle Menschen werden Brüder, wo den sanfter Flügel weit. What does that mean? Joy. Beautiful spark of the gods, daughter of Elysium, we enter drunk with fire, thy heavenly sanctuary, thy enchantments bind together that which custom has divided. All people become brothers where thy gentle wings abide. This was a Schiller drinking song that Beethoven heard in the 1780s and refashioned into one of the most glorious, uplifting, noble pieces of music ever written. Simon Rattle. I said Sir Simon Rattle was Franz Welspermoos. My apologies. Their hair looks alike. And so finally, Beethoven's legacy. A genius who was never satisfied. The conflict and the struggle that defined his life. A man who confronted and conquered his illness. He broke open the door to Romanticism and he shaped music for a century. The modern orchestra devolves from Beethoven. The modern piano devolves from Beethoven. Music criticism devolves from Beethoven. And those last and greatest works, the roar which lies on the other side of silence, as George Eliot said, this monumental, universal, indomitable spirit, who has statues everywhere in Europe. Bonn, of course, worships him. There's 2 statues in Vienna, one in the center of town, and of course one in the Zentralfriedhof next to Schubert and Brahms. He's in the middle. In 1977, both Voyager spacecraft contained golden records, and on those golden records were various types of music from all over the world. The Beethoven pieces were the Fifth Symphony, part of the Fifth Symphony, and part of the Opus 132 string quartet. And so my last moment with you this evening is to listen to the Heiliger Dankesong from the string quartet in A minor, Opus 132, a cathedral of sound that he couldn't hear. And the Heiliger Dankesong is a holy song of thanksgiving. He was sick, as he was sick throughout his life, and he got better, and this is a convalescent giving thanks to the deity in the Lydian mode. We're going to hear the Alban Berg's quartet doing the Heiliger Dankesong movement of the string quartet in A minor, Opus 132. I hate to stop, but it's getting late, especially because it changes to something glorious. So give me 2 minutes. Music is a higher revelation than all wisdom and philosophy. Thank you very much.